Hey everyone, welcome back. We're jumping into part 2 of our epic. What if Naruto was Zoro's reincarnation story, and things are about to get absolutely wild. Last time we saw little Naruto discovering his three-sword style and building his team. Now we're heading to the land of waves where being on the ocean awakens deeper memories, leading to an incredible showdown with Zabuza. Except this time, it's swordsman versus swordsman. Then we're diving straight into the chunin exams where Naruto's reputation as something special starts spreading. Plus that insane encounter with Orochimaru in the Forest of Death that'll blow your mind. We're talking about Naruto channeling sage-level techniques, facing down one of the legendary Sannin, and completely dismantling Neji's whole philosophy about fate in the most epic way possible. This is where our sword-wielding Naruto really starts showing what he's capable of. If you're ready for some legendary fights and character development, hit that like button and let's get started. The boat rocked gently as it cut through the morning mist surrounding the land of waves, and Naruto felt something deep in his chest respond to the rhythm of water against hull. His hands tightened unconsciously on the wooden rail, knuckles white with a tension he couldn't quite explain. This feels familiar. The thought came unbidden, carrying with it fragments of sensation that belonged to another lifetime, salt spray against weathered skin, the creak of rigging in ocean wind, the endless blue horizon that promised adventure and danger in equal measure. For 6 months now, his inherited memories had been surfacing in careful dribs and drabs, manageable pieces that he could process and integrate without losing himself in them. But the ocean changed everything. "You okay, Naruto?" Sakura asked, noticing his white-knuckled grip on the rail. "You look kind of pale." "I'm fine," Naruto replied automatically, though his voice carried a distraction that made both his teammates glance at him with concern. "Just thinking." Kakashi, who had been reading his orange book with characteristic nonchalance, looked up with sharp attention. He'd been observing Naruto's unusual reaction to their maritime journey, and his instincts were prickling with recognition. The boy's entire posture had changed the moment they'd boarded the boat, becoming more alert, more predatory, as if the ocean had awakened something that had been dormant on dry land. Their client, Tazuna, was busy complaining about the mission parameters and muttering about cheap ninja who couldn't even afford a decent boat. But his voice seemed to fade into background noise as Naruto's attention was captured by something far more immediate and overwhelming. The Grand Line stretched endlessly in all directions, its blue surface deceptively calm under the afternoon sun. But Zoro knew better than to trust the ocean's moods. He'd learned that lesson through bitter experience, through storms that could tear apart mountains and calms that could drive sailors mad with their oppressive silence. "Land ho," Usopp called from the crow's nest, his voice carrying across the deck with excitement and relief. "Looks like a small island, maybe 3 kilometers off the starboard bow." Zoro didn't look up from his meditation, maintaining perfect balance despite the ship's constant motion. The Going Merry was more than just transportation. She was home, family, the foundation upon which his dreams were built. Every creak of her timbers was as familiar as his own heartbeat, every shift in her movement a language he understood better than words. "Another adventure," Luffy laughed, his enthusiasm infectious as always. "I wonder what kind of weird stuff we'll find this time." That was Captain for you, always looking forward, always believing that the next island would bring them closer to their dreams. His optimism was magnetic, drawing people into his orbit and making impossible things seem achievable through sheer force of personality. But it was more than charisma that made Luffy special. It was his absolute, unshakable belief that his crew could overcome anything as long as they stood together. That faith had transformed a collection of misfits into a family, and that family had given Zoro something worth protecting with his life. The memory hit Naruto like a physical blow, so vivid and complete that for a moment he forgot where and when he was. The smell of salt air, the warmth of sunlight on his skin, the weight of 3 swords at his side. It all felt more real than the wooden fishing boat carrying Team 7 toward their first C-rank mission. "Naruto," Sakura's voice cut through the vision, sharp with concern. "You're gripping the rail so hard you're leaving marks." Naruto blinked, dragging himself back to the present with considerable effort. His teammates were staring at him with expressions ranging from worry to confusion, while Kakashi had put away his book entirely and was watching with the focused attention of someone evaluating a potential threat. "Sorry," Naruto muttered, flexing his fingers to restore circulation. "Just got a little seasick for a moment." It was a lie, and everyone on the boat knew it. Naruto had been moving with the boat's rhythm like someone born to the water, showing none of the unsteadiness that typically marked landlubbers on their first ocean voyage. If anything, he seemed more comfortable on the water than he'd ever been on solid ground. Seasick, Tazuna snorted. Kid moves like he's been sailing his whole life. You sure you're really from a landlocked village? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Naruto found himself struggling to formulate an answer that wouldn't sound completely insane. How could he explain that he'd never been on a boat before, but somehow knew the exact tension needed in the rigging, could predict the water's movement by the color of the waves, understood instinctively how to fight on an unstable deck? Fortunately, he was saved from having to answer by their guide's sudden tension. "Quiet," the boatman hissed, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "We're approaching dangerous waters. The bridge isn't far now, but this is where." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Everyone on the boat could feel it, the oppressive weight of hidden observers, the sense of being watched by predators who moved like shadows through the mist. That's when Naruto felt it. Killing intent, thick and choking, radiating from multiple sources hidden in the fog around them. But this wasn't the unfocused malevolence he'd encountered from villagers who feared what they didn't understand. This was professional, refined, the kind of lethal purpose that belonged to people who killed for a living. Without conscious thought, Naruto's hand drifted toward his sword hilts. "Get down," Kakashi shouted, just as the first volley of shuriken came whistling out of the mist. The attack was coordinated, precise, designed to disable rather than kill, which told Naruto more about their attackers than any intelligence report could have. These weren't random bandits looking for easy prey. These were ninja, probably chunin level or higher, with specific orders regarding their targets. Team 7 scattered, taking defensive positions around the small boat while Tazuna cowered in the center. But Naruto found himself moving with a fluidity that surprised even him. His body responding to the maritime combat situation with instincts that belonged to another lifetime. Sea battles were different from land engagements. Everything was in constant motion, footing was uncertain, and the environment itself could be as dangerous as any opponent. But Zoro had learned to love these challenges, to use the chaos and unpredictability as weapons in their own right. Drawing his 3 practiced swords with practiced ease, Naruto settled into a stance that accounted for the boat's movement, his weight distributed perfectly to maintain balance regardless of how the vessel pitched and rolled. "Interesting," a voice called out from the mist, cultured and amused. "Most genin would be puking over the side by now, but you move like you were born on the water." The voice belonged to Zabuza Momochi, though Naruto wouldn't learn his identity for several more minutes. What he recognized immediately was the signature of a master swordsman, the controlled breathing, the perfect stillness that preceded explosive movement, the absolute confidence that came from years of dedicated training. Another swordsman. The recognition sent a thrill through Naruto that was equal parts excitement and apprehension. In Zoro's memories, meeting another master of the blade had always been a moment of profound significance, an opportunity to test his skills, to learn from someone who understood the path he'd chosen, to measure his progress toward his ultimate goal. "Show yourself," Naruto called out, his voice carrying an authority that made his teammates glance at him in surprise. "If you're a swordsman, then face me properly." "Bold words for a child," the voice replied, but there was approval in its tone. "Very well, let's see if your skill matches your courage." Zabuza emerged from the mist like death incarnated, his massive Kubikirabacho gleaming dully in the filtered sunlight. He was enormous, easily twice Naruto's height and probably 10 times his weight, but he moved with the liquid grace that marked all true masters of the blade. "Zabuza Momochi," Kakashi breathed, his visible eye widening with recognition. "The demon of the hidden mist. The copy ninja," Zabuza replied with a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Your reputation precedes you, Hatake, but I'm more interested in your student." His gaze fixed on Naruto with the kind of focus typically reserved for legitimate threats rather than academy graduates. "You carry yourself like a swordsman, boy, but can you fight like one?" Naruto's response was to shift his stance slightly, adjusting his grip on his 3 practiced swords in a way that somehow made him look twice as dangerous despite wielding wooden weapons against a legendary blade. "Only one way to find out," Naruto replied, his voice carrying a coldness that made everyone on the boat, allies and enemies alike, step back instinctively. The battle that followed would be discussed in hushed tones by witnesses for years afterward. Zabuza moved first, his massive sword cutting through the air with enough force to split the boat in half. But Naruto wasn't where the blade fell. He was already in motion, using the boat's natural movement to enhance his own speed as he flowed around the attack like water around a stone. "Onigiri," Naruto called out, his three swords converging on Zabuza's position with surgical precision. The technique should have been impossible to execute with practice weapons against a master of Zabuza's caliber. Wooden swords couldn't cut through steel, couldn't generate the kind of force needed to threaten someone who'd survived countless battles against elite opponents. But Naruto had learned to channel chakra through his blades. The wooden sword struck Zabuza's guard with the force of steel, sending vibrations up the massive man's arms that spoke of power far beyond what his young opponent's size would suggest. More importantly, the attack came from three different angles simultaneously, requiring defensive responses that would have challenged most jonin. "Impressive," Zabuza laughed, his surprise genuine. "You really are a swordsman, aren't you?" "Still learning," Naruto replied, already repositioning for his next attack. "But I made a promise to become the world's greatest. That includes learning from masters like you." The admission stopped Zabuza cold. In his experience, young fighters either boasted about abilities they didn't possess or cowered in the face of superior opponents. Naruto was doing neither. He was acknowledging both his current limitations and his ultimate ambitions with the kind of matter-of-fact honesty that belonged to people who'd made peace with the cost of greatness. "The world's greatest swordsman," Zabuza repeated, lowering his blade slightly. "That's a dangerous dream, boy. Are you prepared for what that path demands?" "Everything," Naruto replied without hesitation. "It demands everything you have and everything you are, but some promises are worth keeping no matter what they cost." The weight of absolute conviction in those words sent a chill through everyone present. This wasn't childish bravado or teenage rebellion. This was someone who'd already counted the cost of his chosen path and accepted it completely. "Then show me," Zabuza said, raising Kubikirabacho once more. "Show me the technique of someone who would be the world's greatest." Naruto's response was to close his eyes for a moment, reaching deep into inherited memories for something he'd never attempted before. When he opened them again, his blue eyes seemed to glow with inner fire. "Sanzen Seikai," he whispered. The technique that followed defied rational explanation. Naruto moved faster than should have been possible, his three practice swords creating a whirlwind of motion that seemed to bend reality around its edges. For a moment that lasted forever, he was no longer a 6-year-old genin wielding wooden weapons. He was the inheritor of a legend, channeling power that transcended the limitations of his current form. The attack struck Zabuza's defense with enough force to drive the massive swordsman back 3 steps, leaving deep gouges in the metal of Kubikirabacho, where wooden practice blades had somehow cut through steel. When the motion stopped, Naruto was standing exactly where he'd started, but 3 perfect slashes had appeared in the mist around them, cuts so clean and precise that they seemed to hang in the air like cracks in reality itself. The silence that followed was profound. "Impossible," Zabuza breathed, staring at the damaged metal of his legendary blade. "Those were practice swords, wooden practice swords. They shouldn't have been able to. Technique transcends material," Naruto replied, his voice carrying wisdom that belonged to another lifetime. "A true swordsman can cut anything with anything if his will is strong enough." It was a lesson that Dracul Mihawk had taught Zoro during their final battle, and now Naruto had proved it against one of the 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist. But the demonstration had cost him more than he'd anticipated. The advanced technique had drained his chakra reserve severely, and the effort of channeling memories that complete had left him swaying on his feet. More concerning, he could feel the boundaries between his current identity and his inherited memories beginning to blur in dangerous ways. "I need to be careful," he thought, fighting to maintain his sense of self. "Those memories are powerful, but they're not mine. I can't let them overwhelm who I actually am." The sound of slow clapping broke the tension, and everyone turned to see a figure emerging from the mist, a young person in a hunter-nin mask, moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd never known a life outside of combat. "Beautiful technique," the newcomer said, their voice carrying genuine appreciation. "I haven't seen swordsmanship of that caliber since my master was in his prime." "Haku," Zabuza said, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and affection that seemed at odds with his reputation as a heartless killer. "I thought I told you to wait. You were taking too long," Haku replied with what might have been a smile behind the mask. "And I wanted to see for myself what kind of swordsman could damage Kubikirabacho with wooden practice blades." The byplay between master and student sent another wave of memory through Naruto. not the overwhelming flood he'd experienced earlier, but a gentler recognition of something precious and rare. The bond between Zabuza and Haku reminded him of other mentor relationships, other examples of loyalty that transcended mere professional obligation. They care about each other, Naruto realized. Whatever else they might be, their family. Stand down, Haku, Zabuza ordered, though his tone was gentler than his words suggested. This isn't our fight anymore. What do you mean? Kakashi demanded, his hand still positioned near his kunai pouch. I mean your student just reminded me why I became a swordsman in the first place, Zabuza replied, his gaze never leaving Naruto. Someone with that kind of dedication, that kind of potential. Killing him would be a waste. The admission sent ripples of confusion through both teams. Zabuza, the demon of the mist, abandoning a mission because he respected his opponent's skill. It was unprecedented. Gato won't be pleased, Haku observed quietly. Gato is a coward who hides behind stronger people, Zabuza spat. His opinion is worth less than nothing. Besides, he looked directly at Naruto. I suspect this mission is about to become far more complicated than we were led to believe. He was right, though none of them knew it yet. The bridge construction site was a testament to human ambition and engineering prowess, but it was also a symbol of hope for the impoverished land of waves. Tazuna's great bridge would connect his isolated country to the mainland, breaking Gato's economic stranglehold and giving his people a chance at prosperity. It was also the perfect place for an ambush. Gato's remaining mercenaries, those not smart enough to abandon the mission after Zabuza's change of heart, had positioned themselves throughout the construction site with clear fields of fire and multiple escape routes. They were professionals, experienced in the kind of intimidation tactics that kept entire populations in line through fear. What they weren't prepared for was facing opponents who fought not just for money or orders, but for principles worth dying for. Well, well, Gato sneered as he emerged from behind a pile of construction materials, flanked by 24 armed thugs. The great Zabuza, betrayed by his own student and reduced to protecting bridge builders. How the mighty have fallen. Careful, Gato, Zabuza warned, his voice carrying the promise of violence. I may no longer be in your employ, but that doesn't mean I've forgotten what you are. What I am is rich enough to buy a dozen replacements for you, Gato replied with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. Kill them all, make it messy. The mercenaries moved with professional efficiency, but they were facing opponents who operated on an entirely different level. Kakashi engaged the largest group with the kind of devastating effectiveness that had made him legendary throughout the ninja world. Sasuke and Sakura worked in perfect coordination, their teamwork honed by months of training under Naruto's influence. Even Tazuna proved surprisingly capable with an improvised weapon, defending his life's work with the desperate courage of someone who had everything to lose. But it was Naruto who transformed the battle from a simple engagement into something approaching artistry. Fighting alongside Zabuza and Haku felt like coming home. The three swordsmen moved in perfect synchronization despite having never trained together, their individual styles complementing each other in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Zabuza's overwhelming power created openings that Haku's speed could exploit, while Naruto's three-sword technique provided the tactical flexibility to capitalize on any advantage. More than that, fighting with other dedicated swordsmen awakened memories and instincts that Naruto had never fully accessed before. This was what it meant to have nakama who shared your path. As the battle raged across the bridge construction site, Naruto found himself accessing techniques and strategies that belonged to his inherited memories, but felt completely natural in the current context. His movements flowed like water, adapting to every change in the tactical situation while maintaining the core principles that defined his fighting philosophy. Tatsumaki, he called out, spinning his three swords in a whirlwind pattern that created a localized tornado of cutting force. The technique cleared a swath through Gato's mercenaries, but more importantly, it created the opening that Zabuza needed to position himself for a devastating counterattack. Kirigakure no Jutsu, Zabuza responded, filling the immediate area with thick mist that transformed the battlefield into his personal domain. In the concealing fog, Haku moved like a ghost, his ice mirrors reflecting and redirecting attacks while providing platforms for aerial maneuvers that defied conventional understanding of combat physics. The coordination between the three was flawless, each fighter's strengths covering the other's weaknesses in a display of tactical cooperation that impressed even their opponents. But the real test came when Gato, desperate and cornered, made a critical mistake. "If I can't have the bridge," he snarled, producing a set of explosive tags from his jacket, "then no one can." The tags were positioned to bring down the entire construction site, destroying months of work and probably killing everyone present in the process. It was the kind of spiteful, destructive gesture that perfectly encapsulated everything wrong with Gato's approach to power. "Haku!" Zabuza shouted, recognizing the threat immediately. But Haku was too far away to intercept, and the explosive tags were already activated. In seconds, the bridge would be nothing but rubble and memories. That's when Naruto made a choice that defined the rest of his life. Without hesitation, he threw himself toward the explosive tags, his 3 swords positioned to deflect the blast away from the main support structures. It was a desperate gamble. Success would save the bridge and everyone on it, but failure would mean his death and the destruction of everything Tazuna had worked for. This is what it means to protect what matters. The thought came from both his lives simultaneously. The inherited memories of a swordsman who'd always put his crew's safety above his own, and the personal convictions of a boy who'd learned that some things were worth any sacrifice. The explosion, when it came, was enormous. The concussive force lifted Naruto off his feet and sent him flying across the construction site, his practice swords scattered like broken toys. But his sacrifice hadn't been in vain. The bridge's main supports held, the critical connections remained intact, and the pathway to the land of Wave's future remained open. When the smoke cleared, Naruto was lying unconscious in a pool of his own blood, his small body broken but still breathing. "Naruto!" Sakura's scream cut through the sudden silence, raw with grief and terror. Sasuke was the first to reach him, his usual emotional reserve shattered by the sight of his teammates' injuries. "He's alive," he reported, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "But he's hurt bad." As his friends and Senshi worked frantically to stabilize his injuries, Naruto drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind floating between memories that belonged to 2 different lives. "This is what it feels like to protect your nakama," he thought, remembering countless battles where Zoro had thrown himself between his crew and danger without a second thought. "This is what it means to keep your promises," he reflected, thinking of all the people who'd believed in him in both lives and trusted him to be strong enough when it mattered most. As medical attention brought him back from the edge of unconsciousness, Naruto found himself surrounded by faces that had become precious to him. His teammates, his Senshi, the bridge builder whose dream he'd helped preserve, and even the former enemies who'd become allies through shared understanding of what it meant to follow the path of the sword. "You did it," Tazuna whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "The bridge is safe. My people are free." "We all did it," Naruto corrected weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's what nakama means, we succeed together or not at all." As he spoke, Zabuza knelt beside him with an expression of profound respect. "You have the heart of a true swordsman," the demon of the mist said quietly. "I would be honored to call you a fellow warrior." "The honor is mine," Naruto replied, managing a small smile despite his injuries. "Both of you, you reminded me what it means to fight for something greater than yourself." The bonds forged in that moment would last for years to come. Zabuza and Haku, freed from Gato's employment and inspired by Naruto's example, would go on to become unlikely allies of the Hidden Leaf. The Land of Waves would prosper, its people never forgetting the young swordsman who'd risked everything to protect their future. And Naruto himself would carry the lessons of that battle forward into every challenge that followed. The knowledge that true strength came not from individual ability, but from the connections between people who shared the same dreams. As Team 7 prepared for the journey back to Konoha, Naruto took one last look at the bridge that would soon connect the Land of Waves to the wider world. It was more than just steel and concrete. It was proof that impossible dreams could become reality when people worked together toward a common goal. The world's greatest swordsman, he thought, testing the weight of his ultimate ambition against everything he'd learned during their mission. It's not about being stronger than everyone else. It's about being strong enough to protect the things that matter most. The boat that carried them home rocked gently on the ocean swells, but this time Naruto felt only peace in the water's rhythm. His inherited memories were still there, still powerful, but they no longer threatened to overwhelm his sense of self. Instead, they had become integrated into his identity, not as a burden to be carried, but as a foundation upon which to build something new. The boy who had once been the world's greatest swordsman was well on his way to becoming something even greater. a protector of dreams, a builder of bonds, and a living bridge between the impossible and the inevitable. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, filled with challenges that would test every aspect of his character and ability. But as he sailed toward home surrounded by his nakama, Naruto knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged. The way of the sword had led him to the sea, and the sea had taught him the true meaning of strength. 2 months had passed since the mission to the land of waves, and the scars Naruto carried, both visible and otherwise, had become badges of honor rather than sources of shame. The injuries from the explosion had healed cleanly under the careful attention of Konoha's medical corps. But more importantly, the experience had fundamentally changed how he approached both combat and relationships. Standing in the academy classroom, where the written portion of the chunin exams would soon begin, Naruto surveyed his fellow competitors with the analytical eye of someone who'd learned to see beneath surface appearances. The room buzzed with nervous energy and barely concealed hostility as genin from multiple villages sized each other up, but Naruto felt only calm focus. "Quite a crowd," Sasuke observed, his voice carrying none of the arrogant dismissal that had once characterized his interactions with other ninja. The Wave Country mission had taught him the value of tactical assessment over emotional posturing. "Look at all these potential allies," Naruto replied, his perspective shaped by inherited memories of recruitment and crew building. "Every person here is someone who's dedicated enough to their village and their dreams to risk everything in these exams." Sakura, who had grown significantly in both confidence and capability since their first C-rank mission, nodded thoughtfully. "The question is which ones we can trust and which ones see us as threats to be eliminated." Her tactical awareness had sharpened considerably under Naruto's influence, and she'd begun approaching interpersonal dynamics with the same analytical rigor she applied to academic subjects. The scared girl who'd once defined herself entirely through her crush on Sasuke had evolved into a strategically minded kunoichi who understood that information was often more valuable than raw power. "Trust is earned through action," Naruto said, unconsciously echoing wisdom that belonged to both his lives. "But respect can be established immediately through competence and confidence." As if summoned by his words, a group of sound genin approached their position with the kind of casual aggression that marked people looking for trouble. Their leader, a bandaged boy with wild hair and predatory eyes, carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd never met an opponent he couldn't intimidate. "Well, well," the sound ninja sneered, "if it isn't the famous Team 7. The ones who supposedly defeated Zabuza Momochi with nothing but academy-level techniques." The mocking tone was designed to provoke a reaction, to goad them into revealing information or starting a fight that would demonstrate their capabilities to observing competitors. It was a transparent ploy, but one that many genin would have fallen for. Naruto's response was to smile with genuine friendliness. "Actually, we didn't defeat him," he said conversationally. "We convinced him that killing us would be counterproductive to his actual goals, much more efficient than fighting, and nobody had to die unnecessarily." The casual honesty of the statement, delivered without defensiveness or boasting, clearly wasn't what the sound genin had expected. Most teams would have either denied their involvement entirely or exaggerated their role in the mission's outcome. "You convinced him," the leader repeated, confusion replacing his confident aggression. "Zabuza is a swordsman," Naruto explained patiently, "someone who's dedicated his life to perfecting his art. When he recognized that same dedication in an opponent, he had to reconsider whether completing his mission was worth destroying something rare and valuable." "Are you saying you're as skilled as one of the 7 ninja swordsmen?" one of the other sound genin demanded. "I'm saying I'm someone who understands what it means to pursue impossible dreams with complete dedication," Naruto replied. "Anyone who shares that understanding, regardless of their village or their current skill level, is someone worth respecting." The philosophical response seemed to deflate the sound team's aggressive posture. They'd come looking for typical genin arrogance or insecurity, something they could exploit or mock. Instead, they'd encountered someone who spoke about legendary opponents with matter-of-fact respect and seemed genuinely interested in their perspective rather than threatened by their presence. Before the conversation could develop further, the examination proctors entered the room, and the atmosphere immediately became more serious. Ibiki Morino's scarred face and intimidating presence would have been enough to unnerve most genin, but Naruto found the man's reputation more interesting than frightening. The head of Konoha's torture and interrogation force was someone who understood information warfare and psychological manipulation at the highest levels, skills that complemented physical combat training in ways that most ninja never fully appreciated. As Ibiki explained the rules of the written examination, Naruto listened with the kind of focused attention that his teammates had learned to recognize as his tactical analysis mode. The test wasn't really about academic knowledge. It was about information gathering, risk assessment, and the willingness to trust both yourself and your team when facing impossible odds. The 10th question will be the real test, Naruto realized as he worked through the earlier problems using a combination of inherited strategic knowledge and careful observation of other examinees. This is about whether we're brave enough to risk everything for our dreams, and whether we trust our teammates enough to make that choice for all of us. When Ibiki finally revealed the true nature of the examination, Naruto's response was immediate and unwavering. "I'll take the question," he said, his voice carrying the absolute conviction that had become his trademark. "Whatever the consequences, I won't abandon my dreams or my teammates." The declaration seemed to resonate through the room, inspiring other genin who'd been wavering in their resolve. One by one, teams chose to stay and face the unknown rather than accept guaranteed safety at the cost of their ambitions. This is what leadership looks like, Sasuke thought, watching his teammates' influence spread through the assembled competitors. Not commanding or controlling others, but inspiring them to be braver than they thought possible. The second phase of the examination presented an entirely different set of challenges. The Forest of Death was a primal environment where civilization's rules gave way to the law of predator and prey. Dense foliage blocked out most of the sunlight, creating a twilight realm where danger lurked behind every tree and the line between hunter and hunted could shift in an instant. For most genin, the forest represented their first encounter with truly lethal opposition outside of controlled training environments. The psychological pressure of knowing that death was not only possible, but likely would break many teams before they encountered a single opponent. But for Naruto, the forest felt like home. His inherited memories included countless battles in similar environments, dense jungles where pirates and marines played deadly games of cat and mouse, islands where the wildlife was more dangerous than any human opponent, and seas where the weather itself could kill the unwary. More than familiarity with dangerous terrain, though, he carried the hard-earned knowledge of how to think like both predator and prey simultaneously. The key to surviving this isn't avoiding other teams, Naruto explained to his teammates as they moved deeper into the forest. It's controlling the terms of every encounter we have. "What do you mean?" Sakura asked, though she'd learned to trust Naruto's tactical insights even when she didn't immediately understand them. "Everyone here is operating under the assumption that they need to hunt down other teams and take their scrolls by force," Naruto replied, his voice barely above a whisper as they navigated through the undergrowth. But that approach turns every encounter into a life-or-death battle with uncertain outcomes. "So what's the alternative?" Sasuke inquired, genuinely curious about his teammates' strategic thinking. "We become the team that other teams want to encounter," Naruto said with a slight smile that carried equal parts confidence and predatory anticipation. "We make ourselves valuable enough that negotiation becomes more attractive than combat." The strategy revealed itself over the next several hours as Team 7 made contact with other competing groups. Instead of immediately attacking or fleeing, Naruto would assess each team's capabilities, resources, and objectives, then propose mutually beneficial arrangements. To a team of grass genin who were clearly outmatched by the forest's more dangerous inhabitants, he offered protection and navigation assistance in exchange for information about other competitors' movements. To a group of rain ninja who possessed medical supplies but lacked offensive capabilities, he provided security during their rest periods in return for treatment of minor injuries his team had accumulated. Most surprisingly, he approached a team of sand genin with an offer of temporary alliance based on shared tactical interests. "Your puppet user needs open terrain to maximize effectiveness," Naruto observed to the blonde girl who carried a massive fan. "My three-sword style works best when I can control spacing and positioning. If we coordinate our engagements, both our teams benefit." Temari, though suspicious of any leaf ninja bearing gifts, found herself intrigued by the tactical acumen underlying his proposal. Most genin their age thought in terms of individual techniques and personal glory. This one was thinking like a field commander, considering how different fighting styles could complement each other for maximum strategic advantage. "You're either very smart or very stupid," she said bluntly, allying with another village's team in a competitive examination. "Smart and stupid aren't mutually exclusive," Naruto replied with a grin that reminded her uncomfortably of someone else she knew. "The smartest thing you can do is sometimes also the most dangerous." The temporary alliance proved beneficial for both teams when they encountered the real predator stalking the Forest of Death. Orochimaru's presence was like a wound in reality itself, a concentration of malevolence and power that made the surrounding wildlife flee in terror and caused the very air to feel thick with menace. When he emerged from the shadows between the trees, his pale skin gleaming in the filtered sunlight and his serpentine eyes fixed on Sasuke with unholy hunger, every genin present understood that they were facing something far beyond their current abilities. But understanding the magnitude of the threat and being paralyzed by it were two different things. While his temporary allies and even his own teammates froze in the face of Orochimaru's overwhelming killing intent, Naruto drew his three swords and stepped forward. "Sasuke," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off the legendary Sannin, "get behind me. Everyone else, stay exactly where you are unless I tell you otherwise." "Interesting," Orochimaru hissed, his attention shifting from Sasuke to the small boy who dared to challenge him directly. "Most children would be catatonic with fear by now, yet you face me as if you've encountered true killers before." "I have," Naruto replied simply, his voice carrying echoes of battles fought in another lifetime. "And I've learned that power without purpose is just destruction wearing a crown." The philosophical response seemed to amuse Orochimaru, though his predatory focus never wavered. "And what purpose drives you, little swordsman? What dream justifies standing against one of the legendary Sannin?" "Protecting my nakama," Naruto said, settling into his three-sword stance with practiced precision. "Becoming strong enough that the people I care about never have to face monsters alone." "Noble," Orochimaru acknowledged with mocking approval. "Futile, but noble." "Very well, show me this strength you speak of." The battle that followed was less a fight than a masterclass in the difference between skill and power. Orochimaru moved with fluid grace that made water seem clumsy, his techniques flowing seamlessly from one devastating attack to the next. His killing intent was so refined that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on everything in the immediate area, and his chakra reserves seemed limitless. But Naruto had advantages that weren't immediately obvious. His inherited memories included encounters with opponents whose power transcended normal understanding, pirates who could split islands, marines whose presence alone could alter weather patterns, and monsters whose very existence challenged the laws of physics. More importantly, he carried the hard-earned wisdom of how to face impossible odds without losing either courage or tactical awareness. "Onigiri," Naruto called out, his three swords converging on Orochimaru's position with surgical precision. The technique was perfectly executed, each blade following a trajectory calculated to eliminate escape routes and force his opponent into a defensive response. But Orochimaru simply wasn't there when the swords arrived. He'd moved with speed that made Naruto's attack seem to occur in slow motion. "Impressive form," Orochimaru observed from his new position behind Naruto. "But speed without power is merely elaborate dancing." His counterattack came in the form of multiple summoned snakes, each one moving with lethal intent toward vital points on Naruto's body. It was the kind of overwhelming assault that most genin would have no hope of surviving. Naruto's response was to close his eyes and reach deeper into his inherited memories than he'd ever dared before. In the final battle with Dracul Mihawk, when all seemed lost and his dream hung by the thinnest of threads, Zoro had discovered something that transcended technique or physical ability. He'd found the place where will became reality, where absolute determination could reshape the world itself. When Naruto opened his eyes, they blazed with an inner fire that made Orochimaru step back involuntarily. "Asura." "Ikebujin," he whispered, and suddenly there weren't three swords cutting through the attacking serpents. There were dozens, each one moving with impossible precision and power. The technique should have been far beyond anything a genin could accomplish. It required chakra control that most jonin never achieved, physical conditioning that took years to develop, and the kind of spiritual focus that belonged to masters of the highest order. But Naruto wasn't just a genin anymore. In that moment, channeling memories and will that span 2 lifetimes, he was something approaching the legend he'd once been. The summoned snakes were destroyed so completely that they seemed to simply cease existing, cut apart by blades that moved faster than perception could follow. More importantly, the attack carried enough force to actually drive Orochimaru backward, forcing the Sannin to take his young opponent seriously for the first time. Remarkable, Orochimaru breathed, genuine admiration coloring his voice. You're not just talented, you're touched by something greater than yourself. Everyone is, Naruto replied, his voice steady despite the enormous chakra drain the technique had caused. The question is whether you're brave enough to let that greatness define you instead of being consumed by your own limitations. The philosophical challenge seemed to strike Orochimaru more deeply than any physical attack could have. For a moment, his serpentine features softened with something that might have been regret or recognition. Perhaps, he said quietly, but some of us have traveled too far down dark paths to find our way back to the light. With that admission, Orochimaru began to withdraw, his form dissolving into the shadows between the trees like mist before the morning sun. This isn't over, he warned as he faded from view. Your potential is too great to ignore, and there are those who would see such promise either claimed or destroyed. When the Sannin's presence finally vanished completely, the forest seemed to exhale with collective relief. Birds began singing again, insects resumed their activities, and the oppressive weight that had settled over the area lifted like a physical burden being removed. But the genin who had witnessed the encounter remained frozen in place, struggling to process what they'd seen. You faced down Orochimaru, Temari whispered, awe and disbelief warring in her voice. An academy graduate just faced down one of the legendary Sannin and lived to tell about it. We all faced him down, Naruto corrected gently, exhaustion making his voice hoarse. I just happened to be the one holding the swords. It was a typical response from him, deflecting personal credit while acknowledging the contributions of others, but this time his teammates weren't having it. Don't downplay this, Sasuke said firmly, his usual emotional reserve completely absent. What you just did, I've never seen anything like it. That technique, that power, where did it come from? Naruto was quiet for a long moment, considering how much truth he was ready to share. His inherited memories were becoming stronger, more accessible, but also more dangerous. The line between his current identity and his past life was beginning to blur in ways that could be either empowering or catastrophic. Sometimes, he said finally, when everything is on the line and the people you care about are in danger, you discover that you're capable of more than you ever imagined. But that power comes with a price. It demands everything you have and everything you are. Are you willing to pay that price? Sakura asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. For my nakama, Naruto replied without hesitation. For the people who have chosen to stand beside me and trust me with their dreams, I'd pay any price necessary. The remaining days in the Forest of Death passed with considerably less drama, though Team 7's reputation spread through the competing genin like wildfire. Word of Naruto's confrontation with Orochimaru reached every team still in the competition, transforming him from an interesting anomaly into someone who commanded universal respect. More than respect, though, he'd earned something rarer and more valuable: recognition as someone worth following. Teams began seeking them out not for conflict, but for guidance, treating Naruto's tactical insights as if they came from a seasoned field commander rather than a recent academy graduate. His ability to analyze complex situations, identify optimal strategies, and inspire confidence in others had marked him as a natural leader in ways that formal rank never could. When the second phase concluded, and the surviving teams assembled at the central tower, Naruto found himself surrounded by genin from multiple villages, all of them eager to learn from someone who'd proven capable of facing impossible odds without losing either courage or compassion. The preliminary matches begin tomorrow, announced Hayate Geiko, Naruto's sword instructor who'd been chosen to proctor the elimination rounds. Due to the number of teams that successfully completed the second phase, we'll need to reduce the field before the final tournament can proceed. His gaze lingered on Naruto with obvious pride. The boy he'd been training for over a year had evolved into something extraordinary, not just in terms of technical skill, but in terms of character and leadership. More importantly, he'd managed to integrate his inherited memories without losing his essential humanity. The matches will be one-on-one combat, Hayate continued. Winner advances to the finals, loser goes home. The selection will be random, so prepare yourselves for any opponent. As the electronic board began cycling through names, Naruto felt a familiar sense of anticipation building in his chest. This was what he'd been training for, not just the opportunity to test his skills against worthy opponents, but the chance to demonstrate that strength built on bonds and mutual support was superior to power pursued through isolation and domination. First match, Hayate announced as the board settled on two names, Naruto Uzumaki versus Kankuro of Tsunagakure. Murmurs rippled through the assembled genin as they evaluated the matchup. Kankuro was known as a skilled puppet user, someone whose fighting style relied on misdirection, environmental control, and the ability to attack from multiple angles simultaneously. Against most opponents, his techniques would provide significant advantages in both offense and defense. But Naruto's three-sword style had been developed specifically to handle complex, multi-directional threats. This should be interesting, Temari observed to her brothers, though her tone carried more anticipation than concern. Kankuro's puppetry against three-sword techniques. Two styles that excel at controlling multiple vectors of attack. The question is whether wooden practice swords can cut through reinforced puppet joints, Gaara said quietly, his attention fixed on Naruto with the kind of focus he typically reserved for potential prey. In the arena below, Naruto and Kankuro faced each other across 10 meters of empty space, each fighter taking the measure of their opponent while the assembled spectators settled in to watch. "I've heard about you," Kankuro said as he unwrapped the bandaged bundle on his back. "The swordsman who faced Orochimaru and lived, but puppetry is different from direct combat. You can't just cut your way through my techniques." "You're right," Naruto agreed pleasantly, drawing his three practice swords with fluid precision. "But I don't need to cut through your techniques. I just need to cut through the strings controlling them." The insight struck Kankuro like a physical blow. Most opponents focused on his puppet as the primary threat, trying to destroy or disable the mechanical construct while ignoring the more vulnerable control system. But Naruto had identified the real weakness in puppetry techniques. The chakra threads that connected user to weapon were both essential and fragile. "He's not looking at Karasu," Kankuro realized as his puppet took its combat position. "He's watching my hands, my posture, the way I move. He's tracking the threads by reading my body language." "Begin," Hayate called out, and the battle commenced with explosive intensity. Kankuro's opening gambit was a complex multi-stage attack designed to overwhelm his opponent with simultaneous threats from multiple angles. Karasu attacked from the front with spinning blades, while hidden weapons emerged from concealed compartments, creating a deadly crossfire that should have been impossible to navigate safely. Naruto's response was poetry in motion. Instead of trying to block or deflect the incoming attacks, he flowed between them like water finding the path of least resistance. His three swords moved independently, each one following a different trajectory as he carved through the spaces between threats with impossible precision. More importantly, he was advancing rather than retreating, closing the distance between himself and Kankuro while simultaneously dealing with the puppet's attacks. "Santo Ryu, Toragari," Naruto called out, his swords converging on Kankuro's position in a triangular formation that eliminated most escape routes. But instead of targeting Kankuro directly, the attack was aimed at the chakra threads controlling Karasu. Three precise cuts severed the connections between puppeteer and puppet, leaving the mechanical construct motionless and harmless. "Impossible," Kankuro breathed, staring at his disabled weapon. "Those threads are invisible to most ninja. How did you experience?" Naruto replied simply, repositioning for a follow-up attack. "I fought opponents who used similar techniques. The principle is always the same, control requires connection, and connections can be severed if you know where to cut." Kankuro's backup puppet, concealed within Karasu's body, emerged with its own set of deadly weapons, but Naruto was already in motion. His inherited memories included battles against opponents who specialized in misdirection and hidden weapons, and those experiences had taught him to expect the unexpected. The second engagement was over almost before it began. Naruto's three swords created a whirlwind of cutting force that severed every chakra thread in Kankuro's arsenal, leaving the Tsunagakure genin defenseless and surrounded by the scattered remains of his puppet techniques. "Winner, Naruto Uzumaki," Hayate announced, though his voice carried obvious pride in his student's performance. As Naruto helped Kankuro to his feet, the Sand Ninja was uninjured but clearly shaken by the comprehensive nature of his defeat. Applause echoed through the arena from both competitors and observers. That was incredible, Kinkuro admitted, his professional assessment overriding personal disappointment. I've never seen anyone analyze puppetry techniques that quickly or accurately. Where did you learn to read chakra threads? From someone who understood that every fighting style has both strengths and weaknesses, Naruto replied. The key is recognizing which is which before your opponent does. As they left the arena floor, Kinkuro found himself walking alongside someone he'd initially dismissed as just another Leaf Genin with unusual weapon preferences. Now he understood that Naruto represented something far more significant. A new generation of ninja who approached combat with philosophical depth and strategic sophistication that most veterans never achieved. Hey, Kinkuro said as they rejoined the other competitors, when this is all over, would you be interested in training together sometime? I think I could learn a lot from your approach to combat analysis. I'd like that, Naruto replied sincerely. And I'd like to learn more about puppetry techniques. Any fighting style that requires that level of coordination and tactical thinking has lessons worth studying. The easy camaraderie between former opponents drew approving nods from observers who understood the deeper significance of what they were witnessing. The chunin exams had always been about more than individual advancement. They were about building relationships between villages, fostering mutual understanding, and identifying the leaders who would guide the ninja world into its future. Watching Naruto interact with his defeated opponent, treating him with respect rather than gloating over his victory, made it clear to everyone present that they were observing someone special, not just in terms of combat ability, but in terms of character and leadership potential. As the preliminary rounds continued, Naruto found himself analyzing each match with the tactical acumen he'd inherited from his past life, but also with the emotional investment of someone who genuinely cared about the development and success of his peers. Each fighter represented a different approach to strength, a different interpretation of what it meant to be a ninja, and a different perspective on the relationship between power and purpose. The tournament ahead would test all of those philosophies against each other, determining not just who was strongest, but whose approach to strength would define the next generation of ninja leadership. Standing in the arena's observation area, surrounded by competitors who had become allies and former enemies who had become friends, Naruto felt the weight of destiny settling around his shoulders like a familiar cloak. The boy who had once been the world's greatest swordsman was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, secure in the knowledge that he wouldn't face them alone. His nakama stood beside him, his senshi watched with pride, and his inherited memories whispered of battles yet to come that would require everything he'd learned from both his lives. The path toward his ultimate goal remained long and uncertain, but for the first time since his memories had begun surfacing, Naruto felt completely confident in his ability to walk it successfully. After all, he'd learned the most important lesson any swordsman could master. True strength came not from the sharpness of your blade, but from the bonds that gave your fighting meaning. The month-long break between the preliminary rounds and the final tournament had transformed Team 7 in ways both subtle and profound. While other competitors focused solely on developing new techniques or correcting obvious weaknesses, Naruto had taken a more holistic approach to preparation, one that drew equally from his inherited memories and his growing understanding of what it truly meant to be a ninja of the hidden leaf. Standing in the arena where the finals would soon commence, surrounded by the excited roar of thousands of spectators, Naruto felt a familiar sense of anticipation building in his chest. But this wasn't the simple eagerness for combat that had once defined his approach to conflict. This was something deeper, the recognition that the battles ahead would determine not just individual advancement, but the philosophical direction of their entire generation. His opponent for the first match stood across the arena with perfect posture and an expression of serene confidence that bordered on arrogance. Neji Hyuga carried himself like someone who had never encountered a problem that superior breeding and inevitable destiny couldn't solve, and his pale eyes held the kind of certainty that came from believing the universe itself was arranged for his benefit. Neji Hyuga versus Naruto Uzumaki, the proctor announced, his voice carrying clearly across the packed stadium. Fighters stepped forward. As they met in the center of the arena, Neji's gaze swept over Naruto with the analytical precision of someone cataloging an opponent's weaknesses before the battle even began. "I've heard about your performance in the preliminaries," Neji said, his tone carrying the polite dismissal of someone acknowledging a temporary aberration. "Impressive for someone of your background, but talent without proper breeding is merely a flash in the pan. Today, you'll learn the difference between earned strength and inherited destiny." And you'll learn the difference between destiny and determination, Naruto replied calmly, his hands resting casually on his sword hilts. One of them can be changed through will and effort. The other is just an excuse people use when they're afraid to take responsibility for their choices. The philosophical challenge struck Neji more deeply than any physical provocation could have. His entire identity was built around the concept of predetermined fate, the belief that his status as a branch family member both explained and justified every limitation he'd encountered in life. Fate is absolute, Neji stated with absolute conviction, settling into the opening stance of the gentle fist style. Your birth determines your capabilities, your circumstances define your limitations, and your breeding establishes your ceiling. No amount of effort can overcome the fundamental inequalities written into the very fabric of existence. That's the most depressing worldview I've ever heard, Naruto observed, drawing his 3 practice swords with fluid precision. If you really believed that, you wouldn't be here. The fact that you're fighting to advance, to prove yourself, to change your circumstances, that's proof that you know destiny can be overcome. I fight because it's my nature to fight, Neji replied coldly. Just as it's your nature to lose to your betters. The outcome of this match was determined long before we entered the arena. Then let's find out whose nature is stronger, Naruto said, settling into his 3-sword stance with the kind of predatory focus that made spectators lean forward in anticipation. Begin, the proctor called out, and the battle commenced with explosive intensity. Neji's opening assault was a masterpiece of precision and tactical superiority. His Byakugan revealed every detail of Naruto's chakra system, every potential weakness in his stance, every possible avenue of attack or defense. The gentle fist techniques flowed like water, each strike aimed at vital points that would systematically dismantle his opponent's ability to continue fighting. But Naruto wasn't where Neji's strikes landed. His movement was unlike anything the Hyuga prodigy had encountered before. Not the straightforward speed that most taijutsu specialists relied upon, but something more fluid and adaptive. Naruto seemed to flow around attacks rather than blocking them, using minimal movement to achieve maximum defensive effect while simultaneously positioning for devastating counterstrokes. Impossible, Neji breathed as his perfectly aimed palm strike encountered only empty air. My Byakugan shows me your every movement, predicts your every action. You shouldn't be able to avoid techniques you can't even see coming. Your eyes show you what is, Naruto replied, his 3 swords beginning to move in the intricate patterns that marked the beginning of his more advanced techniques. But they can't show you what could be, and possibility is more powerful than certainty. Kai-ten, Neji called out, spinning himself into a dome of defensive chakra that deflected all incoming attacks while simultaneously striking at anything within range. It was the Hyuga clan's ultimate defense, a technique that transformed the user into an untouchable sphere of destruction. Most opponents would have been forced to retreat, to wait for the technique to end before resuming their assault. Naruto's response was to close his eyes and reach deep into memories that belonged to another lifetime. In his final battle with Dracul Mihawk, when facing the world's greatest swordsman required techniques that transcended normal understanding, Zoro had learned to cut things that couldn't be cut. Not through superior force or speed, but through perfect understanding of what he was trying to sever. A swordsman who cannot cut steel is no swordsman at all, Mihawk had said, his black blade carving through attacks that should have been impossible to counter. But a swordsman who can cut steel, yet chooses not to cut what should not be cut, that is true mastery. When Naruto opened his eyes, they blazed with an inner fire that made the arena itself seem to hold its breath. Santo Ryuogi, Sanzen Seikai, he whispered, and suddenly his 3 practice swords weren't just cutting through air, they were cutting through the very concept of absolute defense. The technique that followed defied rational explanation. Naruto's swords moved faster than perception could follow, each one tracing a path that seemed to bend space around its edges. But more than speed or power, the attack carried an intent so pure and focused that it transformed wooden practice blades into instruments capable of severing anything. When the motion stopped, Neji's Kai-ten collapsed like a soap bubble, the absolute defense revealed as merely another barrier waiting for the right technique to overcome it. How? Neji demanded, staggering backward with his perfect composure finally cracked. That technique is invincible. It has never been breached, never been overcome, never been faced by someone who understands that impossible is just another word for hasn't happened yet, Naruto interrupted gently. Your technique is incredible, Neji, but it's not invincible. Nothing is invincible, that's what makes fighting worthwhile. The philosophical challenge struck at the heart of everything Neji believed about himself and his place in the world. If the Hyuga clan's ultimate defense could be overcome, if predetermined advantages could be negated through will and technique, then what did that say about the nature of fate itself? You don't understand, Neji said desperately, his Byakugan revealing the massive chakra drain that Naruto's technique had caused. I am a branch family member. I am marked, limited, destined to serve those born superior to me. This is the way the world works. The world works the way we make it work, Naruto replied, his voice carrying compassion rather than triumph. You're not fighting me because fate demands it. You're fighting me because you chose to. You're not strong because you were born to be strong. You're strong because you decided to become strong. Every choice you make, every technique you master, every battle you win, that's you changing your destiny. As he spoke, Naruto began moving forward with slow, deliberate steps that somehow seemed more threatening than any explosive charge could have been. Your clan may have marked you, he continued, but you get to decide what that mark means. Your circumstances may have shaped you, but you get to choose how you respond to those circumstances. And your birth may have determined your starting point, but it doesn't have to determine your destination. Hokkei Rokujuyon Sho, Neji called out desperately, launching into the Hyuga clan's most devastating offensive technique, 64 precise strikes aimed at every major chakra point in his opponent's body. It was a technique that required perfect accuracy, flawless timing, and absolute confidence in one's ability to read and predict the opponent's movements. Even partially successful, it would leave Naruto unable to mold chakra properly, effectively ending the fight. But Naruto had been preparing for this exact attack since the moment the match began. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, he called out, creating multiple shadow clones that immediately dispersed in different directions around Neji's position. The gentle fist technique was designed to target a single opponent's chakra system with surgical precision. When faced with multiple identical targets, each one carrying the same chakra signature and moving with the same unpredictable fluidity, Neji's perfect accuracy became a liability rather than an advantage. His strikes landed on clone after clone, each one dissipating in a puff of smoke that obscured his vision and disrupted his Byakugan's ability to track the real target. By the time he realized that the true Naruto was approaching from above, having used his clones as stepping stones to achieve an aerial position, it was too late to mount an effective defense. Onigiri, Naruto called out, his three swords converging on Neji's position with the kind of overwhelming force that left no room for evasion or counterattack. The technique struck Neji's hastily raised guard with enough power to drive him to his knees. His perfect composure finally shattered completely by the undeniable reality of his defeat. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by Neji's labored breathing and the distant sound of an approaching storm, both fighters remained motionless, one kneeling in defeat, the other standing in victory but without triumph. Why? Neji whispered, his voice barely audible. Why couldn't I overcome someone who should have been inferior in every measurable way? Because measurement isn't everything, Naruto replied gently, offering his hand to help Neji to his feet. Strength isn't about what you're born with, it's about what you choose to do with whatever you've got. Before Neji could respond, the arena was suddenly filled with the sound of explosive tags detonating throughout the stadium. Panic rippled through the spectator sections as masked figures appeared among the crowd, and the unmistakable presence of hostile chakra signatures announced that the tournament had become something far more dangerous. Orochimaru, Naruto breathed, recognizing the serpentine chakra signature that had haunted his nightmares since the Forest of Death encounter. The invasion has begun. The sound and sand forces had coordinated their assault with precision that spoke of months of planning and reconnaissance. Sleep-inducing genjutsu fell across large portions of the spectator areas, neutralizing civilian witnesses while leaving the ninja free to engage in combat without restraint. Summoned creatures appeared throughout the village, and the sound of battle echoed from every district as Konoha's defenders mobilized to repel the invasion. But the real target of the assault was in the Hokage's box, where Orochimaru had shed his disguise as the fourth Kazekage and engaged Hiruzen Sarutobi in single combat. "Get to the evacuation points," Kakashi shouted to his students as he prepared to join the village's defense. "This is beyond genin-level threats." Like hell, Naruto replied, his 3 swords already in his hands as he surveyed the chaos around them. These are our people, our village, our home. We don't run from that. Naruto's right, Sasuke said firmly, his Sharingan already activated as he tracked multiple hostile targets moving through the arena. We're ninja of the hidden leaf. This is exactly the kind of situation we train to handle. Sakura nodded grimly, her medical supplies and combat gear at ready. The scared girl who'd once defined herself through her crush on Sasuke was gone, replaced by someone who understood that strength meant standing up when standing up mattered most. The sound ninja who engaged them first learned quickly that they had underestimated their opponents. Naruto moved through their ranks like death incarnate, his 3-sword style adapted for maximum lethality rather than the restraint he'd shown during the tournament matches. These weren't fellow ninja testing their skills, these were invaders threatening his home, his people, his nakama. The philosophical discussions and careful mercy that had characterized his earlier fights were replaced by surgical precision and ruthless efficiency. "Santo Ryu, Tatsumaki," he called out, his spinning swords creating a whirlwind of cutting force that cleared a path through the enemy ranks. But instead of pressing his advantage with another overwhelming technique, he immediately shifted to create openings for his teammates to exploit. "Sasuke, fire jutsu now," he shouted, even as his swords guided the surviving sound ninja into a perfect formation for area effect techniques. "Katen, Gaokukyu no Jutsu," Sasuke responded, his massive fireball consuming the enemies that Naruto had positioned precisely within its blast radius. The coordination between them was flawless, each fighter's strengths complementing the other's abilities in ways that multiplied their collective effectiveness. More than teamwork, though, they were fighting with the kind of desperate determination that came from protecting something precious. "Medical ninja," Sakura called out, spotting wounded Konoha defenders who needed immediate attention. "Cover me while I treat the injured." Without hesitation, Naruto and Sasuke repositioned to create a defensive perimeter around her position, their combined techniques creating a barrier of steel and flame that no enemy could breach. "This is what it means to protect your nakama," Naruto thought as he cut down another sound ninja who tried to flank their position. Not just fighting beside them, but fighting for them, making their safety more important than your own. The lesson belonged to both his lives, the inherited memories of a pirate who'd thrown himself between his crew and danger without a second thought, and the personal convictions of a ninja who'd learned that some bonds were worth any sacrifice. As they fought their way toward the Hokage's location, the scope of the invasion became increasingly clear. This wasn't just a military assault. It was a coordinated attempt to break the will of fire that held the village together, to prove that Konoha's philosophy of mutual protection and shared strength was inferior to the cold pragmatism that other villages embraced. The Sound 4, elite ninja, whose power rivaled that of Jonin-level opponents, had established a barrier around the Hokage's box that prevented interference with Orochimaru's battle against the Third. It was a technique designed to ensure that the legendary Sannin could kill Konoha's leader without interruption, delivering a psychological blow that would cripple the village's resistance. But they hadn't accounted for Team 7's unique combination of abilities and determination. "The barrier is too strong for conventional attacks," Sasuke observed, his Sharingan analyzing the chakra flows that maintained the protective dome. "We need something that can cut through jutsu itself." "Leave that to me," Naruto said grimly, his inherited memories providing insight into techniques that transcended normal understanding. "But I'll need you both to buy me time to prepare." "How much time?" Sakura asked, already calculating medical supplies and tactical positions. 30 seconds, Naruto replied, closing his eyes and reaching deeper into his past life memories than he'd ever dared before. "Maybe less if I can access the right technique." In the final battle with Mihawk, when facing the world's greatest swordsman required power that went beyond normal limits, Zoro had discovered the secret that separated true masters from merely skilled fighters. It wasn't about cutting harder or faster, it was about understanding what you were trying to cut, and why that cut was necessary. "The breath of all things," Mihawk had said, his blade moving with impossible precision through attacks that should have been impossible to counter. When you can hear the breath of steel, the rhythm of stone, the heartbeat of water itself, then you can cut anything. When Naruto opened his eyes, they blazed with power that belonged to both his lives simultaneously. "Ito Ryu Iie, Shishi Son Son," he whispered, though he held 3 swords instead of 1, and the technique had been adapted for chakra constructs rather than physical materials. The attack that followed was unlike anything anyone present had ever witnessed. Naruto's swords moved with such perfect precision and intent that they seemed to cut through the very concept of defense, slicing through the sound force barrier as if it were made of paper rather than concentrated chakra. The barrier collapsed with a sound like breaking glass, leaving the Hokage's box exposed and accessible for the first time since the invasion had begun. But the effort had cost Naruto more than anyone realized. The advanced technique had drained his chakra reserves to dangerous levels, and the strain of channeling memories that complete had left him swaying on his feet with exhaustion. "Naruto," Sakura called out in alarm, catching him before he could collapse completely. "I'm okay," he said weakly, though his pale complexion and labored breathing suggested otherwise. "Just need a moment to recover." "You don't have a moment," Sasuke said grimly, his attention fixed on the battle raging within the now exposed box. "Look." The sight that met their eyes was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Hiruzen Sarutobi, the third Hokage, the professor, the man who had guided their village through decades of peace and war, was locked in single combat with one of the legendary Sannin, and he was clearly losing. Age had diminished his physical capabilities, but not his will or his tactical brilliance. Every technique he used was perfectly executed, every strategy flawlessly implemented. But Orochimaru fought with the cruel efficiency of someone who had abandoned all moral restraints in pursuit of power. And his advantages in speed, strength, and chakra reserves were beginning to tell. "We have to help him," Naruto said, struggling to stand despite his exhaustion. "With what?" Sasuke demanded, though his tone carried desperation rather than dismissal. "You can barely stand. I'm running low on chakra, and Sakura's not equipped for this level of combat. We're genin facing one of the legendary Sannin." "Then we'll have to be genin who fight like something more," Naruto replied, his voice carrying the kind of absolute determination that had once belonged to the world's greatest swordsman. But before they could intervene, the battle in the Hokage's box took a dramatic turn. Hiruzen's hands moved through a sequence of seals that none of them recognized, and suddenly, the air itself seemed to thicken with spiritual pressure. This wasn't just another jutsu. This was something that reached beyond normal ninjutsu into realms that few living people had ever explored. "Shiki Fujin," Hiruzen whispered, and suddenly death itself materialized behind him, a spectral figure with empty eyes and hunger that transcended mortal understanding. "No," Orochimaru breathed, his serpentine features twisting with genuine fear for the first time since the battle had begun. "You wouldn't. The cost is exactly what I'm prepared to pay," Hiruzen replied, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had made peace with his choices. "For my village, for my people, for the future I'll never see but help to create." The technique that followed was beyond anything the watching genin could fully comprehend. It involved forces that belonged to death itself, power that demanded the ultimate sacrifice from anyone who dared to wield it. But it was also undeniably effective. Orochimaru's arms withered and died, his ability to form hand seals permanently destroyed. As the Sannin retreated with his remaining forces, defeated but still alive, Hiruzen collapsed with the satisfied smile of someone who had given everything for something he considered worthy of the price. "Hokage Jisen," Naruto whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks as he knelt beside the dying leader. "Naruto," Hiruzen replied weakly, his eyes focusing with effort on the boy's face. "I'm proud of you, of all of you. The will of fire burns brightly in your generation." "Don't talk like that," Naruto said desperately. "You're going to be fine. The medical ninja will—" "No," Hiruzen interrupted gently. "This is how it ends for me. But not for you, your story is just beginning." As life faded from the third Hokage's eyes, Naruto felt something shift inside him, not just grief for a beloved mentor, but recognition of what leadership truly meant. It wasn't about being the strongest or the smartest or the most talented. It was about being willing to sacrifice everything for the people who depended on you. In both lives, he realized, the greatest leaders were the ones who understood that power was meant to be spent, not hoarded. Standing in the ruins of the arena where he'd begun the day as a genin seeking advancement, surrounded by the devastation of an invasion that had been repelled but not without cost, Naruto felt the weight of destiny settling around his shoulders like a familiar cloak. He was no longer just the inheritor of memories belonging to the world's greatest swordsman. He was someone who had chosen to integrate those memories with his own convictions, creating something new and powerful that belonged completely to neither life, yet drew strength from both. The boy who had once been Roronoa Zoro was gone, transformed into someone who carried that legacy forward while remaining fundamentally himself. And Naruto Uzumaki, the lonely child who dreamed of acknowledgement and belonging, had evolved into someone who understood that true strength came from lifting others up rather than standing alone. As the sun set over the Hidden Leaf Village, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of both sunsets over endless oceans and dawns over familiar rooftops, Naruto made a promise that belonged to both his lives. He would become strong enough to protect everyone who mattered to him. He would honor the sacrifices that had been made for his sake, and he would prove that bonds forged through shared struggle and mutual trust were more powerful than any technique, any bloodline, any destiny that could be imposed from outside. The path ahead remained long and difficult, filled with challenges that would test every aspect of his character and ability. But for the first time since his memories had begun surfacing, Naruto felt completely confident in his ability to walk that path successfully. After all, he'd learned the most important lesson any warrior could master. True power came not from the strength of your blade, but from the bonds that gave your fighting meaning. And surrounded by nakama who would stand beside him no matter what challenges lay ahead, he was ready for whatever destiny or determination would bring. And that wraps up part 2. We just witnessed Naruto go from discovering his abilities to becoming a legitimate force that even legendary ninja have to respect. That moment with Zabuza recognizing him as a fellow swordsman, the Orochimaru encounter, and completely breaking down Neji's worldview, this Naruto is on a whole different level. What was your favorite moment? The bridge battle facing Orochimaru, or maybe that philosophical beatdown he gave Neji? Let me know in the comments. Make sure you're subscribed because part 3 is going to cover the time skip training with Jiraiya and the Sasuke retrieval arc, and trust me, you don't want to miss what this version of Naruto can do after years of sage training. Thanks for watching, catch you next time.